June 3, 1944. 0417 hours. The Aleutian sky was the color of wet steel when Flight Officer Raymond Ainsworth stepped onto the frozen tarmac of Annette Island. A thin band of light bled along the horizon, catching on the riveted skin of the only aircraft in sight, a squat, awkward-looking machine whose wooden fuselage glowed a pale gold in the half-light. The air smelled of kelp dragged in by the tide, and the sharp sting of aviation fuel drifting from the open drums beside the shed. Wind rattled the loose tin sheets along the hangar's side, producing a hollow clatter that echoed across the empty field like distant artillery. Ainsworth touched the nose of the strange little bomber as if greeting a horse before a difficult ride. His glove slid across the smooth, varnished surface. No metal, no armor, nothing but spruce and glue. The Japanese intelligence memos had laughed at it, calling it a toy plane built by lumberjacks. But in the stillness of that morning, with the cold gnawing at his cheeks and the sea murmuring beyond the dunes, the aircraft looked less like a toy and more like a relic of some forgotten craft. Fragile, improbable, and somehow stubbornly alive. The order had been simple: strike a weather station perched on a volcanic ridge the Americans could not reach in time. The Japanese had fortified the slope with anti-aircraft guns scavenged from naval scrap, weapons placed so high and in such treacherous winds that conventional bombers failed before even approaching the clouds above it. The storm patterns alone had grounded 3 squadrons in the previous month, but the Canadian detachment stationed here, the misfits, the experimenters, the curious ones, had a different tool. At 0431 hours, the engine coughed awake. It wasn't the throaty roar of a heavy bomber. It was a thin, high whine, like a saw biting into timber. The propellers, carved meticulously from layered planks, spun with a quicksilver shimmer. Ainsworth climbed into the cockpit, the cold metal of the controls contrasting with the warm, almost organic feel of the aircraft around him. He fastened the straps over his chest and glanced at the mechanic standing by the wingtip, Corporal Theodore Bisson, who raised a hand in a quiet salute. The gesture was small, almost private, 2 men acknowledging the absurdity and the danger of what they were attempting. The tower crackled with static. Toy Bomber 1, cleared for takeoff. Wind southwest, 19 knots. Good hunting. He pushed forward. The plane lunged across the ice-rimmed runway, its wheels bouncing lightly before lifting into the thick air. The wooden frame groaned, and the wind rushed past the canopy like a river tearing through a gorge. Below, the island shrank to a smear of gray rock and pines, swallowed by the vast heaving slate of the Pacific. Climbing toward the cloud band, Ainsworth felt the first tremor of the incoming front. The weather report had warned of turbulence, but the Aleutians never told the truth until you were inside them. The wind punched the aircraft from the left, whirling spindrift across the canopy. The plane juddered, slipped, then corrected itself with a nimble twist of its light frame, something a heavier metal craft could never have done. It darted upward like a swallow finding a gap in a storm. Then the sky broke open. A wall of sleet hammered the fuselage, drumming against the wooden panels with a hollow, percussive violence that made the whole aircraft shake. Ainsworth gritted his teeth as visibility dropped to a fog of gray needles. The altimeter spun erratically as crosswinds toyed with the plane's belly. Everything smelled of cold resin and engine oil. A sharp crack. A sheet of ice ripped from the left wingtip and vanished into the storm. But the toy held. At 0512 hours, the storm thinned just enough for Ainsworth to see the silhouette of the volcanic ridge, a jagged spine of rock rising from the ocean like the back of a sleeping beast. Smoke coiled from vents along its side, hot breath meeting cold sky. Nestled near the summit was the Japanese weather installation, a cluster of shacks and antennae braced against the relentless wind. Beyond it, half buried in snow, were the black mouths of anti-aircraft guns, already turning toward him. The radio crackled with the clipped voices of spotters. "They've seen you." Flak warming. Ainsworth steadied his breathing. He dropped into a shallow dive, skimming the swirling layers of cloud. The first shells burst below him, sharp blossoms of black shrapnel cutting upward. The wooden wings creaked as he banked hard to avoid a second volley. The aircraft was light, unpredictable, just as the designers intended. Steel couldn't have twisted like this. Metal planes would have torn themselves apart at such angles. But this machine flexed with the air, bending with each gust as though it were part of the storm itself. The Japanese gunners miscalculated. Their shells followed a heavier target, one that didn't buck and weave like a living thing. Ainsworth slipped through the gaps. At 0520 he saw the ridge up close. Jagged stones, sulfurous steam, patches of snow clinging to black rock. The installation lay almost vertically beneath him now, an impossible angle for a conventional bomber. But the Canadians had modified the release system for precisely this run. A steep drop, nearly suicidal, followed by a snap pull upward that would stun even the most seasoned pilot. He pushed the nose down. Gravity seized the plane. Wind screamed past the cockpit. The altimeter spun. The ridge rose like a spear. Flak streaked across his path, red tracers melting into white mist. At 300 feet, he armed the payload. At 200, he felt the aircraft begin to shudder, its wooden frame quivering like a bow under tension. At 150, he saw a Japanese crewman below, frozen mid-step, staring upward at the impossible sight of a tiny golden bomber diving straight toward him. At 110 feet, he released. The bombs tumbled in a perfect arc, disappearing behind the lip of the ridge. Then he pulled. The plane resisted, wooden joints creaking, wind battering the undercarriage. For a heartbeat too long, it seemed the aircraft would not rise. A trembling groan reverberated through its frame, the wood bending, flexing, until finally the nose lifted. Ainsworth felt his vision narrow into a tunnel as blood rushed from his head. The ridge scraped past beneath the tail like a blade. A flash erupted behind him, orange and violent, staining the fog. The shockwave rattled the canopy, but the plane climbed, light, stubborn, improbable, and broke through the upper layer of cloud into a sky suddenly calm, quiet, almost blue. He exhaled for the first time in minutes. Below the clouds, the Japanese guns had fallen silent. He didn't know it yet, but that single run, made in a machine mocked as a toy, had just crippled a critical installation whose weather signals fed operations across the northern Pacific. And more importantly, he had just proven something the world had refused to believe. Sometimes the smallest, strangest tool could reach the one place nothing else could. Ainsworth turned the aircraft toward home. The wooden wings glimmered weakly in the newborn sun. The toy bomber had survived the impossible, and the war, in that corner of the world, had quietly shifted. When Raymond Ainsworth touched down on Annette Island at Sykes 24 hours, the morning fog still clung low over the runway like a lingering doubt. The landing gear kissed the ground with a softness that surprised him, as if the little wooden bomber were relieved to be alive. The engine sputtered, coughed twice, then fell into a tired idle, like an old man lowering himself into a chair. The propellers slowed, carving slower and slower circles in the damp air until they stopped entirely, leaving only the ocean wind and his own ragged breathing inside the cockpit. He sat there for a moment, unmoving. His gloves trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear or exhaustion, though there was plenty of both, but from the strange, quiet magnitude of what he had just done. The Japanese guns had fallen silent behind him. The ridge had disappeared into fire and mist, and somewhere out there, beyond the morning haze, the world was already shifting in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He opened the canopy. Cold air rushed in, carrying the brine of the Pacific and the sharp scent of sap baked out of the wings by the engine's heat. Corporal Bisson jogged toward the aircraft, shoulders hunched against the wind, his boots splashing through puddles on the tarmac. When he reached the wing, he didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on the wooden paneling, as though checking whether the machine was still warm, still breathing, still real. Ainsworth climbed down. His knees almost buckled when his boots hit the ground. "You made it," Bisson whispered, though not in amazement, more in reverence. Ainsworth nodded once. She held together. Bisson ran a flat palm along the fuselage. Of course she did. Wood bends, steel breaks. The words lingered in the air, soft and almost philosophical, until the base commander arrived with 2 intelligence officers in tow. Their faces were pale with disbelief. The youngest one kept glancing between the aircraft and Ainsworth as if trying to reconcile the two with the report he held in his hands. The report of a strike every other squadron had failed to attempt, much less survive. "Flight officer," the commander said, voice low, "you realize what you've just accomplished?" Ainsworth didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. The storm, the descent, the explosion. They replayed in his mind not as triumphs but as jagged fragments, each one edged with a kind of exhaustion that felt older than the war itself. They escorted him to the debriefing hut, a drafty wooden room with a single stove burning in the corner, and a map pinned across the far wall. The map showed the ridge, the station, the artillery placements, all now crossed out in thick strokes of pencil. Steam rose from a mug of coffee in front of him, but he didn't touch it. His hands remained clasped in his lap, fingers still curled slightly, as if frozen around the phantom controls of the aircraft. "Tell us exactly what happened." the intelligence officer said. Ainsworth began slowly. The storm, the sleet, the anti-aircraft bursts below the clouds, the near-vertical dive. Once in a while, one of the officers would glance at the others, breaking the facade of composure. They recognized the near impossibility of the maneuver. They recognized, too, that it had only been possible because of that peculiar wooden craft. Light, flexible, half-experimental, and entirely dismissed by the rest of the Allied air forces. When he finished, the hut fell silent except for the crackling of the stove. "You understand," the commander said, "that Tokyo's analysts believe this bomber can't survive a dive beyond 30 degrees. They believe it breaks. They call it—" What was the phrase? The younger officer cleared his throat. "A child's airplane in a man's war." Ainsworth leaned back, the faintest flicker of irony crossing his eyes. "Children, sir," he said quietly, "tend to survive falls better than adults." The officer stared at him, unsure whether it was meant as a joke or a lesson, but the debriefing was only the beginning. By midday, word had traveled across the base. Pilots, mechanics, cooks, clerks, they drifted toward the hangar, gathering around the wooden bomber like villagers around a shrine. The aircraft looked no different than it had before the mission, modest, almost harmless, its grain shimmering faintly where the morning light touched the varnish. But everyone saw it differently now. The laughter that had once followed its early tests, the jokes about lumber camps and toy workshops, had dissolved into something quieter, something bordering on awe. Ainsworth watched from a distance. He didn't feel pride. Not really. What he felt was something colder and heavier, something like understanding. He had survived. The target had been destroyed. And yet, beneath the surface of accomplishment, he sensed a shift, small but profound. War, he realized, wasn't moved by grand machines or grand gestures. It was moved by the strange little things, the forgotten innovations, the experiments no one trusted, the pilots no one expected much from. By evening, he found himself alone by the shoreline, where the land dissolved into tide pools and clusters of kelp that swayed like black ribbons in the surf. The sky was low, bruised purple. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries thin and lonely, carried inland by the wind. He walked slowly, boots sinking into the wet sand. Every so often, the distant roar of twin-engine patrol aircraft echoed across the water, but the sound felt muted here, swallowed by the immensity of the ocean and the volcanic islands that brooded over the horizon. Ainsworth crouched near a driftwood log, touched its brittle surface and realized it mirrored the plane's fuselage, once a living thing, shaped into a vessel that carried impossible weight. Behind him, Bisson approached. "You should sleep," Bisson said. "I will," Ainsworth replied, though the truth was he didn't know if sleep would come. The mechanic sat beside him on the log. "The officers want to know how soon the aircraft can fly again." Ainsworth looked down at his hands. "And you?" Bisson shrugged. "I just want to make sure she doesn't fall apart." There was a pause, a long one. Then Ainsworth spoke, voice low. "When I was in the dive, I felt the frame bending around me, like it was choosing to hold, not because it was strong, but because it was willing." Bisson nodded once. "Wood is like that. It remembers storms." The wind changed. It carried with it a faint scent of sulfur from the volcanic chain to the west. Somewhere beyond those peaks, the ridge still smoldered, the installation still burned, and in that strange smell, the burnt salt, the distant ash, Ainsworth felt the weight of the mission settle into him fully. The Japanese hadn't just lost a station. They had lost the certainty that their ridges, their islands, their fortresses were beyond reach. And the Allies hadn't just gained a victory. They had gained a question. What else could this strange little machine do? Ainsworth looked at the horizon. The Aleutian dusk was closing in, swallowing the last hints of daylight. The ocean shifted, dark and restless, and for a moment, a fleeting, fragile moment, he sensed the world holding its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. He stood. The beach crackled beneath his boots. Behind him, the wind whispered across the wooden walls of the hangar where the toy bomber rested. Not triumphant, not exalted, just alive. Alive enough to fly again. Alive enough to change something more. 3 days after the strike on the ridge, the Aleutian weather turned savage again. Sheets of freezing rain whipped sideways across the base, stinging like needles and carving temporary rivers through the gravel paths between the hangars. Wind slammed against the metal doors, making them shudder in irregular pulses, as though some giant creature were prowling outside, exhaling against the walls. Inside Hangar 4, A single lamp flickered above the wooden bomber, its dim orange glow settling across the fuselage in trembling patches. Ainsworth stood near the tail section, his jacket collar pulled high, watching as Bisson worked beneath the left wing. The mechanic's breath came out in pale clouds. His hands moved with the calm precision of a man repairing something that, by all logic, should not have survived as long as it had. "You flew her too hard," Bisson murmured, tightening a bolt with careful pressure. The dive warped the inner spars. The whole wing flexed 2 degrees beyond the estimate. Ainsworth leaned closer, tracing the faint ripple beneath the surface where the wood had bent. "Will she hold?" "With enough sanding and bracing," Bisson said. "She'll do more than hold, she'll adapt." The word hung in the cold air. Adapt. It felt like the unofficial motto of the Aleutian detachment. Nothing here behaved the way it should. Engines froze in midsummer. Radios crackled with volcanic interference. Fog rolled in with a mind of its own, swallowing runways in minutes and lifting just as suddenly. Even the men changed. Voices quieter, tempers shorter, eyes older. The war in Europe raged with its great steel monsters, but here on these damp, lonely islands, survival wasn't about armor. It was about endurance, improvisation, stubbornness. It was about knowing how to bend. Ainsworth watched as Bisson slid out from under the wing, wiped his hands on a rag and stood with a grunt. Together, they walked the length of the aircraft. Rain hammered the tin roof above them, roaring like distant surf. The bomber's pale wooden skin gleamed under the lamp, slick and glistening, almost alive. "Command wants another run," Ainsworth finally said. Bisson didn't respond at first. He placed both palms on the fuselage, spreading his fingers as though feeling for a pulse beneath the varnish. "Of course they do," he muttered. "Once something impossible works, they want it to work again." The mechanic stepped back. His face was tired but steady. "What's the target?" Ainsworth exhaled slowly. "A listening post, hidden in the cliffs near Kiska. No radio contact for weeks. They think the Japanese fortified the inlet." "That's not a target," Bisson said. "That's a grave." Ainsworth gave a thin smile. "They said the same about the ridge." Bisson shook his head, though not in disagreement, more in resignation. "I'll have her ready by dawn." As the storm grew louder, Ainsworth remained inside the hangar long after the others left. He walked around the aircraft again and again, studying each ripple in the wood, each mark left by cold and wind and shrapnel. Memories of the dive returned. How the plane had shivered around him, how it had seemed seconds away from snapping apart. Yet it hadn't. It had curved with the sky. It had yielded without breaking. It had trusted him. Outside, thunder growled over the ocean. He placed a hand on the cockpit frame. "Just one more," he whispered. "One more time." But the weather would not cooperate. For 2 full days the storm pinned the entire base to the ground. Sheets of volcanic ash mixed with the rain, drifting across the runway like gray snow. Patrol crews huddled in the mess hall, sharing weak coffee and stories of ships swallowed by the fog. The officers grew increasingly anxious. The intelligence reports indicated unusual radio silence from the western chain, silence that could mean nothing, or everything. On the 3rd evening, the weather broke. Not completely. Aleutian skies rarely cleared, but enough for a desperate window. The wind dropped. Visibility stretched to half a mile. The rain thinned into a cold mist that clung to the skin but didn't bite. The air felt tense, fragile, as though the entire atmosphere were holding itself together just long enough for someone foolish enough to take advantage of it. Ainsworth was already in his flight suit before the order came. By 0430, the wooden bomber was rolled onto the runway. Bisson stood by the nose, his tools neatly packed away, his expression unreadable. He touched the fuselage with the back of his hand, a quiet ritual, then stepped away without a word. Ainsworth climbed into the cockpit. The engine sputtered to life, its thin whine familiar now, almost comforting. The propellers spun in perfect arcs, flinging droplets of mist outward like a halo of shattered glass. He checked each gauge, each switch. Everything trembled just slightly, but everything worked. The tower crackled. "Toy Bomber 1, cleared for departure. Winds light from the southwest. You are our only aircraft flying this morning. Godspeed." Ainsworth pushed forward. The wheels left the ground. The sea opened below him. The mission to Kiska was longer, colder and lonelier than the ridge strike. The clouds closed around him like curtains, thick and luminous, swallowing all sound except the persistent, high-pitched hum of the engine. Icing formed on the wingtips within minutes, thin crystalline patterns crawling along the wood like frost spreading across a window pane. He knocked the de-icing controls twice until the ice cracked and fell away into the gray void below. Hours passed. He flew by instrument alone, the world reduced to needles dials and the faint vibration of wood responding to every shift in the wind. Now and then, an opening in the clouds revealed jagged glimpses of volcanic islands, black stone rising from the sea like the backs of prehistoric beasts. Nothing moved on them. No birds, no ships, just wind and ancient rock. South of Kiska, the clouds finally broke. Ainsworth descended slowly, letting the bomber sink through the ragged gap until the surface of the ocean appeared, dark, turbulent, reflecting the bruised sky above. In the distance, cliffs rose sharply from the water, sharp as broken teeth. Snow clung to their ledges. Faint trails of steam drifted from vents near the base, and tucked between two rocky spines was a narrow inlet, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. That was the place. The listening post was hidden somewhere among those cliffs, buried so deep in stone that only a pilot willing to fly low enough, close enough, recklessly enough could find it. Ainsworth tightened his straps. He lowered the nose. The bomber slipped toward the inlet, skimming just above the water. Spray lashed the underside of the fuselage. The cliffs loomed larger, darker. Wind curled unpredictably around their edges, threatening to flip the light aircraft with every gust. Ainsworth fought the controls, nudging, correcting, coaxing the plane through the unstable air like guiding a skittish animal through a narrow alley. Then he saw it. At first, only a shadow, too straight, too deliberate to be natural. Then a glint of metal, then a cluster of camouflaged netting draped over wooden structures, and beside them, half hidden by the stone, the unmistakable outline of an artillery emplacement turning toward the sky. The Japanese had fortified the inlet after all, and they had seen him. A flash burst from the cliffside. The first shell detonated behind him, rattling the tail. A second exploded near the water, spraying his canopy with salt and debris. The third streaked past the wing, so close he felt the heat of it. Ainsworth pulled the bomber into a tight arc, the wooden frame bending, trembling, but holding. The cliffs closed in. Wind roared. Another shell burst, shaking the sky itself. He saw the narrow gap between two rock pillars, a suicidal gap, a gap no metal aircraft could possibly navigate, but wood could bend, and he could trust it. He aimed for the impossible opening and flew straight toward it. The cliffs raced at him like a closing jaw. The bomber shuddered. The world narrowed, and Ainsworth committed. He disappeared between the stone teeth of the inlet, with only inches to spare, vanishing into a place no pilot had ever dared to fly before. For a heartbeat, there was only darkness, cold, mineral, absolute. The cliffs swallowed the bomber like a throat closing around a whisper. The wings trembled inches from the jagged stone, their tips slicing through threads of mist that clung to the inner walls of the narrow passage. Ainsworth kept his eyes forward, barely blinking. Every muscle in his body tightened into a single line of intent. The engine's thin whine echoed strangely in the canyon, bouncing back at him in distorted tones as though the aircraft were arguing with its own reflection. The gap twisted sharply left. He twisted with it, then right, then downward by several feet. The bomber shivered, adjusting with the instinctive near-organic movements that only a wooden frame could manage. Metal would have scraped, sparked, shattered. The toy bent instead, bowing with the airflow, gliding with impossible flexibility through a channel carved by centuries of wind and volcanic pressure. Behind him, the cliffs rumbled with distant artillery. The Japanese gunners were firing blindly now, unsure whether he had struck the walls or slipped through to the hidden basin on the other side. They couldn't imagine any aircraft surviving that turn. They weren't wrong to doubt. Ainsworth felt his breath coming fast. Frost crawled up the inside of the canopy from his exhalations, but he didn't dare wipe it away. He needed both hands on the controls as the darkness ahead thinned and a faint ghost-like glow appeared, a widening slit of raw Aleutian daylight. The canyon spat him out. For a moment he hovered between blindness and clarity. Then the world snapped into focus. He had emerged into a circular basin sealed from the sea, an inland crater carved by lava ages earlier. Steam hissed from vents in the rock. Snow clung to the rim, and clustered along the interior wall, half camouflaged under nets and brush, stood the true heart of the Japanese outpost. Radio towers, fuel drums, barracks reinforced with logs, and a central command shack wedged deep into the stone. No ship could enter. No ground unit could approach unseen. Aircraft, they believed, could not physically reach it. Until now. Ainsworth leveled the bomber. The wind spun in tight vortices through the crater, swirling ash and snow in thin spirals. The wooden plane trembled not with fear but with responsiveness, as though it understood what came next. Ainsworth lined up his approach, flying low along the interior curve of the basin. The garrison noticed him at last. Shouts rose. Gun crews scrambled. Doors flew open. Men ran along the ridgeline like dark figures cut out of the rock. Tracer fire burst from the inner walls. Ainsworth banked sharply, the plane's wings nearly brushing the snow-covered surface of the basin. Bullets snapped past the canopy, stitching the air with glowing threads. A few punched through the wooden skin behind him, sending splinters scattering across the cockpit floor. He ignored them. He focused on the main shack, on the antenna array, on the cluster of fuel barrels stacked too close together. He dropped lower. The wind hammered the fuselage. The gunners adjusted their aim. One shell exploded against the rock face, showering him with debris. Another burst beneath the left wing, tipping the aircraft violently. He corrected with a quick jerk of the ailerons. The target filled the front glass. Close now. Impossibly close. Ainsworth armed the payload. A shout erupted from a platform near the shack. A single Japanese officer, coat flapping in the wind, raised his binoculars in disbelief, as if the sight of this golden wooden machine defying the geography itself had shattered every assumption he held. Ainsworth released the bombs. They fell in a clean, straight line, silent, humble shapes tumbling toward the heart of the installation. He pulled up. The bomber strained, trembling as the crater walls approached from both sides. Wind howled through the vents. The propellers blurred into white discs. The wooden frame bent further, then bent further still, flexing to a degree no engineer would ever have dared put on paper. And then the world behind him ignited. The blast was enormous. Flames tore across the basin floor, racing from fuel drum to fuel drum, swallowing the antenna towers in a roaring cascade of fire. A wave of heat punched upward, lifting the bomber for a split second before gravity seized it again. Ainsworth gritted his teeth and aimed for the only exit, a narrow cleft on the opposite side of the crater, a sliver of sky that looked far too small to pass through. He went for it anyway. The plane shot forward, riding the updraft of the explosion. Smoke forced its way into the cockpit through the imperfect seams of the wooden frame. The engine whined in protest. The wings shuddered violently as he threaded the bomber through the jagged opening, scraping one wingtip against the rock with a sharp, splintering hiss. A strip of wood tore free, spiraling behind him like a falling leaf. Then the sky opened again. He burst into clean, frigid daylight, out, away, free. The crater burned behind him, sending a rising plume of black smoke into the pale morning. Snowflakes drifted across the mountainside, illuminated by the fire's orange glow. The wind carried the smell of burning cedar and diesel and volcanic stone. Ainsworth steadied the aircraft. It was damaged. One wing shook irregularly. The engine sputtered every few seconds. Oil streaked the glass. But it flew. Against all odds, it flew. Far beneath him, the inlet he had crossed earlier continued to thunder with artillery fire. But it was aimed at shadows now, at echoes, at ghosts. He climbed through the thinning clouds. The toy bomber had done the impossible twice, and now it only needed to stay in the air long enough for the world to know.